For years, the cultures of East Asia had heavily resisted any attempt by foreign powers to open up to maritime trade. In China and its de facto protectorate of Korea, much of this was due to the idea that China, as the Middle Kingdom, had little to learn from the outside world. After all, on all sides it was surrounded by barbarians, most epitomized by the Mongols to the north, and it was better for the survival of the kingdom if all external influence was avoided in favor of traditional Confucian teachings. In Japan, the hesitation in regards to outside trade was similar, but instead of being rooted in an admiration for Chinese indigenous culture, it was instead based on the idea that Japan should only adopt those cultural practices that particularly suited its society. It was for this reason that Japan had traditionally sent envoys to China to learn the best of Chinese practices, but to ignore aspects that would not sit well in Japanese culture. That said, there were exceptions. Zheng He, a Chinese admiral, led a massive fleet and an expedition of trade and goodwill throughout the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. He established contacts with cultures as far away as Africa. Notably, however, any talk of Zheng He reaching America is simply not true. His men would have introduced the same diseases that devastated native populations decades later when Columbus arrived. However far-reaching Zheng He's expeditions were, his exploits were largely ignored by the next imperial administration, which chose to focus more on internal affairs than expressing Chinese power abroad. However, despite the best efforts of the powers that be in China, Japan, and Korea, the temptation of goods was simply too great. Principal among these was silk, which was legendary since the Roman period for its quality in the West. However, it wasn't just silk that the Europeans were after. The East Asians still had porcelain, tea, and foods that could not be obtained in such quality anywhere else. Just as importantly, these East Asian cultures represented significant potential markets for European merchants. With the conquest of the New World, European nations, especially Spain and Portugal, but later England and Holland as well, were flush with cash and eager to make more of it by selling the products of their colonies to these new East Asian markets. Manila, the first Spanish colony in the Philippines, was a prime example of how the Europeans eventually gained access to the markets of East Asia. Manila was set up as a staging point for the vast amounts of silver coming from the western coast of South America, as well as other products out of the vast Spanish Empire. From here, Chinese merchants could venture out and come into contact with European goods. In doing so, they created a demand for European goods in their home countries, which the Europeans were able to leverage for access to the markets. Ironically, it was not the Spanish who were the first to capitalize on this new demand. Instead, it was the Portuguese who were able to make the first profits in China and Japan. By 1557, the Portuguese had gained the right to build a trading post at Macau, an island just miles from the Chinese coast. Originally, the Chinese had given the Portuguese the right to only anchor their ships, refusing them the right to disembark. Within a few decades, however, Macau grew into one of the largest European colonies in Asia, despite the fact that it was confined to a very small area of a handful of islands. Macau would remain a Portuguese island until 1999, when it was transferred back to China. The Portuguese were also the first to open trade in Japan, although their time there would be much shorter. In 1543, a ship landed in Japan, blown off course, but still carrying many goods that the local Japanese were interested in acquiring. Ultimately, the Portuguese were able to remain there for decades, but made the mistake of heavily using missionaries to further their goals. Ultimately, this infuriated a subsequent local administration, so he closed Japan to foreigners. There was, however, one exception. The Dutch were permitted to keep their site at Deschelma, an artificial island built for them in the harbor of Nagasaki in 1641. This was due to not only the fact that the Dutch limited their attempts at converting the Japanese, but also due to the very vocal opposition that the Dutch had for the Portuguese. Remember, by this point the Dutch were very Protestant and the Portuguese were still Catholic, meaning there was plenty of bad blood between the two. This lesson discussed the difficulties of trade in East Asia for the first European merchants. Of particular note, there were philosophies that limited trade from outsiders in Japan and China, as well as the discouragement of expeditions, such as that of Cheng Ha. Further, we talked about the establishment of the Spanish base at Manila, as well as the Portuguese base at Macau. Finally, we learned about the role of the Europeans in Japan, particularly the expulsion of the Portuguese and the Dutch post at Deschamps.